Picture this. The year is 1798. A young French general, not yet 30 years old, stands on the deck of a 120-gun warship, scanning the horizon of a continent he has never seen. Behind him, 400 ships, 38,000 soldiers, and 167 of the greatest scientific minds in Europe. Ahead of him, Egypt, the cradle of civilization, and the key, he believed, to strangling the British Empire. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of the moment the ancient world collided with the modern one, and what happened when medieval steel met Enlightenment firepower. To understand what Napoleon was doing sailing into the Mediterranean with half of France's army, you have to understand Napoleon himself. By 1798, he had already humbled the Austrians in Italy. He had paraded through Milan like a Roman emperor. The French Directory, the committee of 5 men technically governing France, was terrified of him. A general this popular, this magnetic, loose in Paris, was a coup waiting to happen. So they gave him an expedition. But Napoleon wasn't being exiled. He was being unleashed. His obsession was Alexander the Great. While other generals studied terrain maps, Napoleon studied Plutarch. He genuinely believed he was the reincarnation of a world historical force. "Europe is a molehill," he reportedly told his intimates. "Everything here wears out. My glory is already past." To him, Egypt wasn't a military objective. It was a destiny. The plan had strategic logic, too. If France controlled Egypt, it could build a canal, this is 60 years before Suez, and threaten Britain's trade routes to India. Cut India, and you cut the beating heart of the British Empire. Napoleon's expedition was, in a single stroke, an ego project, a geopolitical masterstroke, and an act of Enlightenment colonialism. He brought with him not just soldiers, but botanists, linguists, mathematicians, and artists. The Commission of the Sciences and Arts, 167 scholars crammed into warships alongside artillerymen, was his calling card to history. Napoleon wanted to discover Egypt, not just conquer it. Here is something that almost changed the entire course of Western history. Somewhere in the Mediterranean, in the fog and dark of a June night, 2 fleets passed within miles of each other without knowing it. On one side, Napoleon's armada of 400 ships. On the other, the British Mediterranean fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson, the one man capable of stopping the expedition before it began. Nelson had been hunting Napoleon for weeks. He was faster, he was aggressive, and he was furious at having missed him at Toulon. That night, the British fleet slipped northward while the French slipped southward, and the world held its breath, without knowing it. Had Nelson found Napoleon in open water, there would have been no Battle of the Pyramids, no Rosetta Stone, no Egyptology, perhaps no Egyptian campaign at all. Instead, Napoleon arrived off Alexandria on July 1st, 1798, and the real nightmare began. The landing at Marabouts Beach was a catastrophe of logistics. French soldiers, dressed in heavy wool uniforms designed for the winters of northern Europe, stepped into 40 degrees Celsius of Egyptian summer. The sand reflected the heat upward. The sun hammered it downward. Within hours, men were collapsing. The march toward Cairo was unlike anything Napoleon's veterans had experienced. Chronic dehydration, ophthalmia, a savage inflammation of the eyes caused by sand and glare, left men effectively blind. Bedouin skirmishers harassed the flanks, vanishing into the desert before the French could respond. There was no glory here. There were just suffering men in thick wool, dragging cannon through sand. "We are being led to our deaths in a furnace," wrote one officer in a letter intercepted by the British. Napoleon had promised his troops the Orient. What they got was heat stroke and empty canteens. And yet they kept marching. Because Napoleon had seen something the Mamluks had not yet understood, that the age of the cavalryman was over. To understand why the Battle of the Pyramids was so decisive, you have to understand who the Mamluks actually were. Since the 13th century, this warrior caste, mostly of Georgian and Turkic origin, enslaved as boys and raised to fight, had ruled Egypt. By 1798, they were led by a Dumvirat, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, two men who commanded absolute loyalty from the finest horsemen on earth. A single Mamluk warrior in full battle dress was, by any measure, magnificent. Each rider carried a carbine, 2 pistols, a mace, and a Damascus steel scimitar so sharp it was said to cut a silk handkerchief dropped through the air. Their horsemanship was legendary. Their courage was unquestioned. Their armor gleamed. But there was a fatal flaw in the Mamluk army, and Napoleon saw it immediately. They were an army of individuals. Brilliant individuals, certainly, but with no conception of systematic, coordinated discipline. The Mamluks charged. That was their answer to everything. The charge of 5,000 elite horsemen had shattered armies for 3 centuries. Why would French infantry be any different? What Murad Bey could not have known was that French infantry was not like any infantry Egypt had ever seen. On the morning of July 21, 1798, Napoleon deployed his 5 divisions into an arrangement that would become one of the most studied tactical formations in military history, the divisional square. Imagine a hollow rectangle of soldiers, 6 ranks deep on every side. Bayonets leveled outward, artillery positioned at the corners. In the center, the cavalry, the baggage, the engineers. And in a detail that tells you everything about Napoleon's priorities, the scholars. Napoleon had positioned his scientists inside the squares for protection. He valued them more than his cavalry. As his troops formed up on the west bank of the Nile, with the pyramids of Giza shimmering 15 kilometers away on the horizon, Napoleon allegedly turned to his men and delivered one of the most quoted lines in military history. "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The speech was theatrical. The tactics were clinical. And when Murad Bey looked across the desert at the French formations, he reportedly laughed. 5 squares of infantry, no defensive line, no fortifications. He ordered the charge. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, thousands of Mamluk cavalry, draped in silk and gold, screaming war cries across the sand, began their charge toward the French squares. What happened next was not a battle. It was a lesson. The French waited. They did not break. They did not run. And when the Mamluks were within 50 paces, the first volley erupted from 600 muskets simultaneously. The front rank of horses went down. The second volley hit the second wave. The third volley created a wall of carcasses that the surviving Mamluks could not ride through. They circled the squares, searching frantically for a gap, a weakness that simply did not exist. All the while, 4-pounder horse artillery shredded them with grapeshot from the corners. The Mamluks had faced infantry before. Infantry broke. Infantry always broke in the face of a determined cavalry charge. But these men had been drilled by the French Revolutionary Army into something the Mamluks had no framework to comprehend. Soldiers who were more afraid of their own officers than they were of a charging horseman. The pivot came when Napoleon saw the charge falter. He ordered an immediate counteroffensive toward the village of Mbabeh, where Mamluk infantry was poorly entrenched along the Nile. The French stormed the fortifications with the bayonet. What happened at the riverbank was, frankly, tragedy. Thousands of Mamluks and their retainers, panicking, threw themselves into the Nile. Many of them drowned, weighed down by their armor and by the gold coins they had sewn into their clothing. The Mamluks carried their wealth on their bodies, a practice born from centuries of political instability. In those moments, the weight of their accumulated fortune dragged them under. By 4:30 p.m., 1 hour after the battle had begun, the military power of the Mamluks was finished. Murad Bey fled south with the remnants of his cavalry. French casualties, approximately 29 dead, 260 wounded. Mamluk losses, estimated near 6,000. It was not a battle. It was the end of an era. Napoleon rode into Cairo in triumph. He issued proclamations declaring himself a friend of Islam, a liberator from Ottoman misrule, a servant of the Egyptian people. "I have come to restore your rights," he announced, while his soldiers occupied the mosques and his tax collectors moved through the markets. It lasted 3 weeks. On August 1st, 1798, Admiral Nelson, the man who had missed Napoleon in the fog, found the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. In the Battle of the Nile, Nelson destroyed it almost entirely. The flagship L'Orient, carrying the treasury of the expedition, exploded in a blast so massive it silenced both fleets for 10 minutes. Napoleon's army was stranded. His dream of an Eastern Empire was over before it had truly begun. And yet the world was permanently changed. The scholars Napoleon had sheltered inside his squares, those 167 men he had valued more than his cavalry, kept working. They surveyed temples. They mapped the Nile. They sketched, measured, catalogued. From their work came the Description de l'Égypte, a 23-volume masterpiece that introduced the ancient world to European consciousness for the first time. And during the digging of fortifications near Rosetta, a French officer found a black granite slab inscribed in 3 scripts. The Rosetta Stone. That single object, brought back to Europe, allowed Jean-François Champollion to crack the code of hieroglyphics 30 years later. Napoleon's military failure had accidentally created the entire field of Egyptology. Here is what the history books often gloss over. Napoleon told the Egyptians he was their liberator. He brought the printing press. He brought modern medicine, modern engineering, modern science. And he brought it all at gunpoint, against the will of the people he claimed to be freeing, while extracting their resources and dismantling their existing power structures. The Battle of the Pyramids is celebrated as a tactical masterpiece. And it was. But it was also the opening act of a pattern that would define the next 2 centuries. Western powers arriving in the Middle East with a civilizing mission in one hand and a bayonet in the other, and insisting, with complete sincerity, that the two were not in contradiction. Was the scientific progress of the Egyptian expedition a genuine gift to humanity, or was it simply the most sophisticated justification for theft that the Age of Enlightenment could produce? Can a civilization truly be enlightened through the barrel of a gun? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this video valuable, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who loves history. We'll see you in the next one.